Footsteps echoed against the cold pavement as time mercilessly slipped away. Augustin had exactly 10 minutes to secure a stable future for his young son, but a desperate gasp from the shadows stopped him dead. He threw away his final chance, completely unaware the dying stranger owned his destiny. Morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of a tiny, one-bedroom apartment in downtown Chicago, casting long, harsh shadows across a kitchen table buried in past-due bills. Augustin Mitchell stood before a small mirror held up by peeling adhesive, meticulously adjusting a fading burgundy tie. At 34, the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes made him look 10 years older. He had spent the last 2 years raising his 7-year-old son, Toby, entirely alone after a brutal battle with illness, took his wife, Clara, and completely drained their life savings. Today was not just another Tuesday. Today was the absolute precipice of their survival. Augustin smoothed the lapels of his charcoal suit. It was his only suit, bought over half a decade ago, painstakingly preserved, and freshly pressed the night before. He needed to project the image of a confident, successful corporate strategist, not a desperate single father who was precisely 3 days away from receiving a final eviction notice. "Dad, are my shoes okay?" Toby stood in the doorway of the cramped bathroom, holding up a pair of scuffed sneakers. The boy's unruly brown hair stuck up at odd angles, and his oversized backpack made him look even smaller than he was. Augustin's heart gave a familiar, painful squeeze. He knelt down, bringing himself to his son's eye level, and offered a reassuring, warm smile that masked the relentless anxiety churning in his stomach. "They look perfect, buddy," Augustin said softly, reaching out to double knot the frayed laces. "You ready for school? Remember what we talked about?" "You have a big meeting today," Toby recited, his bright blue eyes wide with innocent solemnity. "You're going to talk to the important people, and then we can get extra pepperoni on Friday." Augustin swallowed hard against the lump forming in his throat. "That's right, extra pepperoni. Now, grab your coat. We have a bus to catch." The position Augustin was interviewing for was the Director of Strategic Operations at Langdon Enterprises, a monolithic, multi-billion-dollar corporate empire that dominated the city's skyline. Landing this job would mean an end to the suffocating panic that woke him up in cold sweats every night. It meant comprehensive health insurance, a safe neighborhood, and a college fund for Toby. The interview had been a miracle to secure, a result of 3 months of relentless networking, late-night portfolio building, and calling in every professional favor he had left in the industry. As they stepped out into the biting morning chill, the city was already awake. A chaotic symphony of blaring horns, rushed commuters, and the distant rumble of the elevated train. Augustin gripped Toby's small hand tightly as they navigated the crowded sidewalks. He dropped the boy off at the local elementary school's early care program, lingering just long enough to watch Toby disappear through the heavy double doors. "Please," Augustin whispered to the universe, staring up at the towering glass skyscrapers in the distance. "Just let this work out." He checked his worn wristwatch. It was 8:15 a.m. His interview was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp on the 45th floor of the Langdon Tower. He had perfectly calculated the commute, a 15-minute subway ride followed by a 10-minute brisk walk. It gave him 20 minutes to spare, ample time to review his notes, dry his palms, and compose himself. Augustin descended into the subterranean gloom of the subway station. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. He swiped his transit card, relieved when the turnstile clicked open on the first try. He stood on the crowded platform, silently rehearsing his opening statements, clutching his leather portfolio so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Augustin Mitchell," he muttered to himself, adjusting his posture to stand taller. "I am the ideal candidate to streamline Langdon's European acquisitions. My background in distressed assets uniquely positions me to." The train arrived with a deafening screech of metal on metal. He stepped aboard, finding a small pocket of space near the doors, and closed his eyes. Every rhythmic clack of the wheels over the tracks felt like a countdown. 10 minutes. 5 minutes. The train doors hissed open at his destination, and Augustin stepped out onto the platform, his heart hammering against his ribs in a steady, heavy rhythm of pure anticipation. The Langdon building was only 4 blocks away. He was going to make it. Emerging from the subway station, Augustin was greeted by the towering, imposing monolith of Langdon Enterprises, looming at the end of the avenue. Its sleek, black glass facade reflected the morning sun like a dark mirror. He began his brisk walk, expertly weaving through the dense throngs of distracted, phone-obsessed pedestrians. His watch read 8:38 a.m., perfect timing. As he turned down a slightly narrower side street to bypass a construction detour, a sharp, sudden noise sliced through the ambient city hum. It sounded like a heavy thud, followed by a muffled, agonizing groan. Augustin paused, his polished shoes scuffing against the concrete. He glanced toward the source of the sound, a narrow, dimly lit service alley squeezed between two towering parking garages. Most pedestrians simply hurried past, their eyes glued to their screens, actively ignoring the shadows. City dwellers were conditioned to mind their own business, to keep walking. But Augustin heard the groan again, weaker this time, accompanied by the clatter of a metal trash can lid hitting the pavement. "Hello?" Augustin called out, taking a tentative step toward the alley entrance. Deep in the shadows, a figure lay crumpled on the filthy asphalt. It was an older woman. She was dressed in a simple, unbranded gray trench coat, her silver hair tangled and falling across her face. A younger man in a dark hoodie was violently tugging at a leather bag strapped across her shoulder. "Let go, you old hag," the mugger hissed, delivering a vicious kick to the woman's ribs. Augustin didn't think. The adrenaline hit his bloodstream like a freight train, entirely short-circuiting his anxiety about the interview. He dropped his leather portfolio, his meticulously prepared charts, his resume, his entire future onto the wet sidewalk. "Hey, get away from her!" Augustin bellowed, his voice echoing fiercely off the brick walls as he sprinted into the alley. Startled, the mugger looked up, his eyes widening as Augustin charged at him. Realizing the strap of the bag was caught on the woman's arm, the thief made one last, desperate yank, sending the woman's head crashing brutally against the sharp corner of a concrete loading dock. The sickening crack of impact echoed in the narrow space. The thief abandoned the bag and bolted down the opposite end of the alley, disappearing over a chain-link fence in seconds. Augustin slid to his knees beside the fallen woman. The harsh reality of the situation crashed over him. This wasn't just a mugging, this was a critical medical emergency. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Augustin asked, his voice trembling slightly. The woman was unresponsive. Her face was deathly pale, and a terrifying dark pool of crimson was rapidly expanding from beneath her silver hair onto the grimy pavement. Her breathing was shallow, jagged, and uneven. Augustin fumbled in his pocket, pulling out his ancient smartphone with shaking hands. He dialed 911, pressing the speaker to his ear as he used his free hand to frantically assess her injuries. 911. "What is your emergency?" the dispatcher answered. "I need an ambulance immediately," Augustin shouted over the background noise. A woman was attacked in the alleyway off 5th and Monroe, behind the parking garage. She hit her head on concrete. She's unconscious and bleeding heavily. "Units are on their way, sir. Can you safely apply pressure to the wound?" Yes, I can." Augustin didn't hesitate. He tore off his pristine charcoal suit jacket, balling up the fabric without a second thought. He pressed the expensive wool firmly against the deep laceration on the back of the woman's head. The thick, warm liquid immediately soaked through the material, staining his white dress shirt and coating his hands. "Stay with me," Augustin pleaded, looking down at her face. Despite her pale, drawn features, there was an unmistakable air of stoic authority about her. "Help is coming. Just hold on." His watch caught his eye. The digital display cruelly mocked him. 8:46 a.m. Panic flared in his chest. If he left now, if he sprinted, he might still make it to the Langdon Tower by 9 a.m. The ambulance was coming. She wasn't alone. He had done his civic duty. If he missed this interview, he and Toby would be out on the street. The eviction notice wasn't a threat. It was a legal certainty. He slowly lifted his blood-soaked jacket, intending to gently lower her head. As he shifted, the woman's eyelids fluttered open. Her piercing, steel-gray eyes locked onto his. She was disoriented, struggling to focus, but her hand weakly reached out, her trembling fingers gripping the blood-stained cuff of his white shirt with surprising, desperate strength. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. "Please, cold." Augustin stared down at her frail, trembling hand, then up at the mouth of the alley where his portfolio lay abandoned. He thought of Toby. He thought of the eviction. He thought of the Langdon executives sitting around a polished mahogany table, glancing at the clock, waiting for a candidate who would never walk through the door. "I'm not going anywhere," Augustin said softly, his voice cracking. He removed his tie, the one Toby had picked out for him years ago, and used it to help secure the makeshift bandage. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. Augustin knelt in the filth, the cold seeping through his slacks, murmuring comforting words to a stranger who drifted in and out of consciousness. The distant wail of sirens finally pierced the city noise, growing louder and more frantic. By the time the paramedics rushed down the alley with their trauma kit and stretcher, it was 9:12 a.m. The EMTs took over with practiced efficiency. "Good job with the pressure," one paramedic said, glancing at Augustine's ruined clothes. "You probably saved her life. We're taking her to Mercy General." Augustin stood up, his legs shaking, his suit destroyed, his hands stained deep crimson. He watched as they loaded the silver-haired woman into the back of the ambulance. Just before the doors slammed shut, she turned her head slightly on the backboard. Her sharp, calculating gaze met his through the narrowing gap, burning his face into her memory before the flashing lights pulled away into the traffic. Augustin was left entirely alone in the damp alley. He slowly walked out to the main street and picked up his leather portfolio. It was scuffed from the pavement, but the papers inside were safe. He checked his watch. 9:18 a.m. He was nearly 20 minutes late. It was a professional death sentence. The lobby of Langdon Enterprises was an intimidating cathedral of wealth and corporate power. Vaulted ceilings, imported Italian marble floors, and massive abstract sculptures screamed of absolute authority. Augustin pushed through the heavy revolving doors at exactly 9:26 a.m. He felt the immediate stinging judgment of the security guards. He caught his reflection in a mirrored pillar, and his heart sank. His suit jacket was missing, left behind in an ambulance. His once crisp white shirt was violently stained with rust-colored splotches of drying blood and streaked with alley dirt. His tie was gone. He looked like a man who had just survived a bar brawl, not a seasoned financial strategist arriving for a six-figure executive interview. Approaching the towering front reception desk, Augustin tried to project whatever shred of dignity he had left. "Excuse me," Augustin said, his voice raspy from shouting in the alley. "I have a 9 o'clock interview with the executive board for the Director of Strategic Operations position. My name is Augustin Mitchell." The receptionist, a sharply dressed man with an earpiece, looked him up and down with undisguised disgust. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back from the desk. You are improperly attired, and your appointment time has long passed." "I know I'm late," Augustin pleaded, leaning slightly forward, desperate to make them understand. "There was a severe medical emergency on my way here. A woman was attacked. I had to wait for the paramedics. If you could just call up to Mr. Caldwell's office." "Richard Caldwell does not tolerate tardiness, Mr. Mitchell, regardless of the excuse." A smooth, arrogant voice interrupted from behind him. Augustin turned to see Gregory Hayes standing near the elevator banks. Gregory was perfectly tailored in a bespoke navy suit, holding an artisan coffee, looking like the poster child for corporate success. They had crossed paths years ago at a previous firm. Gregory was ruthless, deeply privileged, and Augustin's direct competition for this role. "Hayes," Augustin muttered, tightening his grip on his battered portfolio. Gregory offered a condescending smirk, his eyes sweeping over Augustin's ruined clothes. "Rough morning, Augustin? Did you forget how to tie your shoes, or did you just lose a fight with a garbage truck?" "I just finished my interview." Caldwell was incredibly impressed. "When you didn't show up? Well, let's just say they consider punctuality a baseline metric for competence." "I was saving someone's life, Gregory," Augustin said, his jaw tightening. "Right." Gregory chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Always the dramatic excuse for a lack of discipline. Maybe you should stick to whatever entry-level gig you can scrape up. Langdon isn't looking for a mess. They're looking for leadership." Augustin ignored him, turning back to the receptionist. "Please, call Richard Caldwell's office. Just tell them I am here and ask for 3 minutes to explain." The receptionist sighed dramatically, picking up the phone. He spoke quietly into the receiver, his eyes locked on Augustin the entire time. After a brief, clipped exchange, he hung up. "Mr. Caldwell's assistant said the position is actively being finalized with another candidate," the receptionist said coldly. "Your interview has been officially canceled. You need to leave the premises immediately, sir, or I will have security escort you out." The words struck Augustin with the blunt force of a physical blow. Canceled. It was over. The months of preparation, the sleepless nights, the quiet promises he had whispered to Toby in the dark, all of it dissolved into thin air in the middle of a pristine marble lobby. "I understand," Augustine whispered, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of reality. He turned and walked back out the revolving doors, completely ignoring Gregory Hayes' smug, triumphant smile. The city air felt colder now. Augustin wandered aimlessly for hours, his mind a chaotic blur of numbers, calculations, and creeping despair. He walked until his feet blistered, desperately trying to figure out how he was going to explain this to his son. How do you tell a 7-year-old that the Hero Act cost them their home? By 3 p.m., Augustin stood outside the elementary school chain-link fence, waiting for the bell to ring. He had managed to buy a cheap, oversized sweatshirt from a discount store to hide his bloody shirt, completely draining the last $20 in his checking account. The doors burst open, and a flood of children poured onto the playground. Toby spotted him almost instantly, his face lighting up with a radiant, gap-toothed smile. "Dad!" Toby yelled, sprinting across the blacktop and throwing his arms around Augustin's waist. Augustin hugged his son back tightly, burying his face in Toby's messy hair, fighting back the hot tears stinging his eyes. "How did it go?" Toby asked eagerly, pulling back to look up at his father. "Did you talk to the important people? Do we get pepperoni?" Augustin's chest heaved. He forced a smile, the most painful smile of his entire life, and gently cupped Toby's cheek. "The interview didn't happen, buddy. I had to help someone who was hurt. I was late, and they couldn't see me." Toby's face fell slightly, processing the information. Then, with the pure, unwavering logic only a child possesses, he reached out and patted Augustin's arm. "That's okay, Dad. Helping someone is better than a meeting. You're a good guy. We can have plain cheese pizza. I like cheese better anyway." A single tear broke free, tracking down Augustin's cheek. He quickly wiped it away, nodding. "Yeah, plain cheese. Come on, let's go home." Home. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. They were heading back to an apartment they would legally lose on Friday. Augustin had done the right thing, the honorable thing, and the universe had rewarded him with total, inescapable ruin. As they boarded the bus back to their bleak reality, Augustin pulled his phone out. He needed to start searching for any job, night shift, janitor, warehouse stalker, anything to put food on the table. But as the bus rattled forward, Augustin's phone buzzed in his hand. It wasn't an email. It was a phone call from an unknown, unlisted number. He stared at it, his thumb hovering over the screen. Debt collectors usually called from local numbers. Hesitantly, he swiped to accept. "Hello?" Augustine said, his voice completely hollow. "Mr. Augustin Mitchell?" A sharp, professional female voice asked on the other end. "Yes, speaking." "Please hold for a moment. You have a very important call." Static crackled softly over the phone line, stretching the silence into an agonizing eternity. Augustin sat frozen on the rattling city bus, his arm wrapped protectively around Toby's small shoulders. He half expected a ruthless collection agent to start demanding payments he couldn't make, but the voice that finally broke through the hold music was entirely unexpected. "Mr. Mitchell?" It was a woman's voice. It was raspy, weak, and strained, yet it carried an unmistakable gravitational pull of absolute authority. It was a voice accustomed to issuing commands that shifted markets, a voice that did not ask for permission. "This is Augustin," he replied cautiously, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who is this?" A low, dry chuckle echoed through the receiver, followed immediately by a sharp wince of pain. "You have terrible taste in neckties, Augustin Mitchell. Though, I suppose I shouldn't complain, considering it is currently functioning as a rather effective tourniquet around my skull." Augustin's breath hitched in his throat. His grip on his phone tightened until his knuckles ached. "Ma'am? The woman from the alley? Are you all right? The paramedics took you to Mercy General. I am alive, which is a statistical anomaly my doctors are currently attributing entirely to your remarkably fast response," the woman stated, her tone shifting into sharp, businesslike precision. "I am currently in the intensive care recovery wing at Mercy General. I need you to come here immediately." Augustin glanced down at Toby, who was busy tracing shapes into the condensation on the bus window. Then he looked at his own reflection, taking in the cheap, oversized sweatshirt hiding his ruined clothes. I'm glad you're safe, ma'am, truly," Augustin stuttered, the crushing weight of his reality settling back over him. "But I have my son with me. We're on the bus heading home. I don't have the money for a taxi to the hospital, and to be perfectly honest, I've had a day that has completely dismantled my life. I'm afraid I can't be of any more help to you." "Mr. Mitchell, I'm not asking for your help," the woman replied softly, a hint of genuine empathy piercing her stoic facade. "I am attempting to offer you mine. Where is your bus currently located?" Augustin frowned, looking out the window at the passing street signs. "We just crossed over West 43rd and Elm." "Why?" "Get off at the next stop. Wait on the corner," she commanded, the line abruptly clicking dead. Augustin stared at the darkened screen of his phone, completely bewildered. Every rational instinct told him to stay on the bus, to go back to his cramped apartment and figure out how to pack their meager belongings before Friday's eviction. But there was something undeniably compelling about the woman's voice. A tiny, irrational spark of hope ignited in his chest. "Come on, Toby," Augustin said, pressing the stop request button. "We're going to take a little detour." They stepped off the bus onto the chilly corner of 43rd and Elm. Less than 2 minutes later, a sleek, heavily armored black SUV with tinted windows aggressively pulled up to the curb, its hazard lights flashing. The rear passenger door swung open, and a towering man in a flawlessly tailored dark suit stepped out. He looked like an elite private security contractor, complete with a discreet earpiece. "Augustin Mitchell?" the man asked, his gaze sweeping the street with trained, hyper-vigilant precision. "Yes," Augustin said, instinctively stepping in front of Toby. "Miss Nelson requested I bring you to the hospital safely. Please, get in." Augustin hesitated for only a fraction of a second before ushering Toby into the cavernous, leather-scented interior of the vehicle. As the SUV seamlessly merged back into city traffic, Augustin's mind raced. Nelson. The name echoed in his memory, triggering a massive, earth-shattering realization. Vianney Nelson. The elusive, fiercely private founder and chief executive officer of Langdon Enterprises. She was a self-made billionaire, a titan of industry known for her brilliant acquisitions and unforgiving standards. When they arrived at Mercy General, they bypassed the crowded, chaotic, public emergency room entirely. The security detail escorted Augustin and Toby through a private subterranean entrance, leading them directly into a restricted elevator that required a biometric scan to operate. They ascended to the penthouse level, where the doors opened to a floor that looked more like a 5-star luxury hotel than a hospital. Soft, warm lighting illuminated rich mahogany-paneled walls and thick, noise-absorbing carpets. 2 armed guards stood outside double doors at the end of the corridor. As Augustin approached, they stepped aside, allowing him to push the heavy oak doors open. The suite was massive, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. In the center of the room, hooked up to an array of softly beeping monitors, lay the woman from the alley. Her silver hair was carefully brushed back, though a thick white bandage wrapped securely around her head. Despite the IV lines and the pallor of her skin, she sat propped up against the pillows, holding a tablet and dictating an email to an exhausted-looking assistant. Vianney Nelson looked up as Augustin entered. Her steely gray eyes locked onto him with the intensity of a predator assessing a situation. "You can leave us, Sarah," Vianney instructed her assistant, waving a dismissive hand. The assistant quickly gathered her things and scurried out, closing the heavy doors behind her. Augustin stood awkwardly near the entrance, holding Toby's hand. "Miss Nelson," he breathed, the reality of the situation finally settling over him. "You figured it out. Good. I prefer dealing with intelligent men," Vianney said, shifting slightly with a grimace. "Please, sit down, both of you." Augustin guided Toby to a plush leather sofa before stepping closer to the hospital bed. "I don't understand. If you are the CEO of Langdon Enterprises, why were you walking alone in a service alley without security?" "Because I despise the gilded cage my wealth has built around me," Vianney replied bluntly. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, I walk the final 6 blocks to my building, entirely alone, dressed like an ordinary citizen. It grounds me. It reminds me of what the real world smells like, sounds like, and feels like. Today, it reminded me that the real world occasionally hits back." She set her tablet down and offered a small, knowing smile. "But more importantly, today taught me a profound lesson about the nature of the people trying to work for my company." Vianney reached over to her bedside table, picking up a sleek remote control. She pressed a button, and a massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the opposite wall flickered to life. The screen displayed high-definition security footage from the Langdon Enterprises lobby. Augustin watched, his stomach dropping, as the video played out the humiliating encounter from earlier that morning. There he was, covered in Vianney's blood, desperately trying to reason with the receptionist. And there was Gregory Hayes, looking impeccably groomed, laughing directly in his face. "When I regained consciousness," Vianney began, her voice dropping to a dangerous low decibel, "I demanded my head of security track down the man who ruined his expensive wool jacket to save my life. It wasn't difficult. He pulled the 911 dispatch records, got your name, and cross-referenced it. Imagine my absolute shock when I discovered my savior was actively scheduled to interview with my own executive board for a director position." Augustin stared at the floor, completely unable to meet her gaze. "I tried to make it. I really did." "I know you did," Vianney said softly. "I watched the lobby footage. I watched my receptionist treat you like garbage. I watched you plead. And I watched Gregory Hayes, the man, my board, led by Richard Caldwell, selected for the position 30 minutes later, mock a man who was covered in the blood of another human being." She paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence fill the lavish hospital suite. In the corporate world, Augustine, we are constantly drowning in metrics, Vianney continued, her tone sharpening into pure, unadulterated executive command. We look at profit margins, risk assessments, and quarterly projections. But you cannot teach character. You cannot train a man to sacrifice his own desperately needed future to kneel in the dirt and hold the shattered skull of a stranger. Gregory Hayes is a shark. He will make the company money, but he would absolutely step over my bleeding body on the sidewalk if it meant advancing his own career. You threw your life away for me. I just did what anyone should have done, Augustine argued weakly, though his heart was hammering wildly against his ribs. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending humanity is inherently decent, Vianney snapped back, though her eyes betrayed a deep respect. 10 people walked past that alley while I was bleeding out. You were the only one who stopped. She reached back to her bedside table, retrieving a thick manila folder. She tossed it onto the edge of the mattress. I made a few phone calls from this bed an hour ago, Vianney stated, her steely gaze locking onto Augustine's. First, I fired the lobby receptionist. Second, I informed Richard Caldwell that his judgment in character is fundamentally flawed, and if he ever attempts to hire a sociopath like Gregory Hayes again, he will be joining him in the unemployment line. I personally rescinded Hayes' offer. Augustine's breath caught. He took a hesitant step forward. Miss Nelson. I don't need a director of strategic operations, Augustine, Vianney interrupted, her expression entirely unreadable. Augustine felt the floor drop out from underneath him. The spark of hope that had kept him going for the last hour instantly vanished. She brought him here just to thank him. He was still going to lose the apartment. No, Vianney continued, a fierce, triumphant smirk finally breaking through her stoic expression. I need a vice president of European acquisitions. I need a man who understands distressed assets because he has lived through severe distress himself. I need a man who will sit at my right hand, who has the absolute moral fortitude to tell me the truth, and who prioritizes doing the right thing over doing the profitable thing. The starting salary is $450,000 a year, plus stock options. And because I am deeply indebted to you, the role comes with a signing bonus of $50,000, completely payable today. Augustine's knees literally buckled. He reached out, grabbing the edge of the hospital bed to steady himself. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, finally spilled over his eyelashes. He couldn't speak. His mind short-circuited trying to process the astronomical numbers. The eviction was over. The suffocating terror of poverty was gone. Toby's future was absolutely, unequivocally secure. Is the boy hungry? Vianney asked softly, watching Augustine's emotional collapse with profound, quiet dignity. Augustine nodded silently, fiercely wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his cheap sweatshirt. Toby, isn't it? Vianney called out, her voice suddenly much gentler. Toby slid off the leather sofa and tentatively walked over to the bed, looking up at the terrifying, powerful woman with wide, innocent eyes. Yes, ma'am. Are you feeling better? Much better. Thank you. Vianney smiled, genuinely and warmly. Your father told me earlier today that he promised you extra pepperoni pizza. It just so happens that I have the best private chef in the city downstairs in the hospital kitchen. Do you think you and your dad could stay and have lunch with me? Toby looked back at Augustine, who was openly weeping, a radiant, broken smile of pure relief plastered across his face. Only if my dad says it's okay, Toby whispered. We were supposed to just get plain cheese today. Vianney laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the sterile room. Toby, from now on, you get whatever toppings you want. Augustine walked over, picking his son up and holding him tightly against his chest. He looked at the silver-haired titan of industry, fully realizing that in the darkest, most desperate moment of his life, his decision to be a good man had not cost him his future, it had actually built it. Thank you, Augustine choked out, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers. Vianney Nelson settled back against her pillows, closing her eyes as the monitors beeped in a steady, calming rhythm. No, Augustine, thank you. Now, let's get down to business. I have a company to run, and you are already 20 minutes late for your first executive briefing. Did Augustine's incredible sacrifice and ultimate reward inspire you? Sometimes, the most important tests in life aren't the ones we prepare for, but the sudden choices we make when no one is watching. If you believe that true character and kindness will always eventually win, drop a like on this story. Don't forget to share this amazing journey with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, heartwarming real-life dramas every single week.